involved in his local community. Unfortunately, that stream had some technical difficulties because I kind of wanted to talk to him about CRT and critical race theory and how some conservatives like James Lindsay are going to be using this as sort of a boogeyman in terms of how they think about critical, like just in terms of the discussion around race. You'll see this a lot of times when they talk about things like, oh, the left wants to convince you that America is always racist, it's always bad, it's intrinsically problematic. But I want to talk about this in terms of what it is, what it isn't, and how it's not quite what they make it out to be. It's not quite what they're trying to make this seem like, especially when you consider that CRT is not the only theory that is taught in academia, especially in like sociology classes, political science classes, or in history classes for that matter either. Before I begin, I'm just going to open this window. I'm just getting started, so we're not starting just yet. The stream's just opening up to make sure everything is working, because Lord knows we had a problem earlier today, and unfortunately we lost track of all of that. I'm just going to turn off notifications real quick. Don't show. So yeah, with the Rico thing, we're going to reschedule that. We're just going to try and find a different way to stream. Either we're not going to do it through Discord, or we're going to try and see if we can do it in time where we can sit down and just not have to worry about the internet happening like that. But in the meantime, I'm going to try and do some streams looking over my discussion with the Tabernacle when I get the chance to try and figure out when we're going to do a live stream. And then we can try and figure out other products. But right now, I'm just making sure everything's working, and let's see if we can get some people in before we start. And I'm also making sure it's not picking up other things on my screen without my permission. Cool, it looks like it's not. And also, I'm just making sure I send this to the group because things got a little hectic with this as well. So let me just make sure that everything's working. All right, it looks like everything is working. I'm just making sure on Twitch we are seeing everything. Yeah, you heard the stream on Twitch happen a bit because I just wanted to make sure that we were all seeing everything. Keyframe interval too high. I don't seem to think anything is having a problem at the moment. So, I'm just waiting for this to get going. Also, I just wanted to bring up earlier that our podcast had a bonus episode. So, for those of you who don't have the time to watch the interview that I had with the Tabernacle, who is a leftist YouTuber and streamer, you can see that on the podcast. So if you go to Spotify or Apple Podcast or Stitcher or Google Podcast and look up The Progressive American, you can see that there as well. But yeah, all of that content will be available. The YouTube video's up. There's going to be some more articles coming out soon. But yeah, I just wanted to say that hopefully this doesn't happen. But we'll begin right now. So this video was published a while back. I'm a bit late on this front, particularly because critical race theory has been a frustrating thing in how it's discussed, mostly on the right. Anytime you see things talking about any sort of anti-bias training or things like that, conservatives tend to use it as an example of the problems of critical race theory, even though a lot of that could be construed as corporatism, and this video kind of does a lot of discussion surrounding that. So without further ado, let's begin.
Have you heard about critical race theory? I'm guessing you probably have. It has already insinuated itself into many institutions and is making rapid progress into others. If it takes hold, it will completely change the very nature of America and the way you live. Critical race theory holds that the most important thing about you is your race. The color.
Okay, there's a few things I gotta note, because this is a really short video, and I want to be able to talk about this without having just listening through it and not talking about it as it goes. Anytime there's a major academic theory in academia, in schools, in any of this, it's going to change the fabric of how we think about a country. So it's a little weird that the way in which they say things like it's changing the fabric of the country, and then the graphic sort of shifts in a way that makes it look like America's turning upside down, as if that's a bad thing. Change is a part of really society overall. I don't really think it's something that we need to worry about all that much. But also, critical race theory while it examines the role of race and power, it does not presume or in any way moralize about that characteristic. You merely having a racial characteristic, or multiple, because sometimes people have different ancestry that intersects with one another, does not in any way make you more or less of a human being under critical race theory's paradigm. Critical race theory examines the roles of power dynamics and how that contributes to oppression and abuse and things like that, and how best to deal with those things in an overall theory. Now, you don't have to necessarily agree with that methodology, but that's what it does, rather than just simply presuming that they only care about race, because there's more to it than that.
Of your skin, that's who you are. Not your behavior, not your values, not your environment. Your race. In critical race theory, if you are a member of a minoritized racial group, their term, not mine, you are a victim of a system that is rigged against you, a system that doesn't want you to succeed. On the other hand, if your race is privileged, you're an exploiter, whether you intend to be or not. Critical race theory begins from the assumption that racism occurs in all interactions. To see how this works, consider this thought experiment. Imagine you own a shop and two customers enter at the same time, one white and one black. Who do you help first? If you help the black person first, critical race theory would say you did so because you don't trust black people to be left alone in your store.
Not necessarily. There are two ways you could go about this. It's possible that the white person went in and they came in first, and therefore you came under that attention. But critical race theory wouldn't just take an anecdotal singular thing and just say, yes, this is the only way that this incident can be carried out. You could have multiple black people come into your store under multiple times, under multiple days, and suddenly that the person who's running the store, running the discourse surrounding it, running the store, running everything in it, and they repeatedly choose to only talk to the white patrons, or they assist the white patrons first. That would be a moment where critical race theory would examine things, would say, hey, perhaps this has to do with your race. And it's not merely just simply shouting racist. It's talking about, again, power dynamics. How does this business affect the broader community? Power dynamics are the point of this. And I'll get into critical race theory as a monolith too, because it's not so simple as, any one critical race theory. It's a multitude.
That's racist. If you help the white person first instead, critical race theory would say you did so because you think blacks are second-class citizens. That's racist too. That's critical race theory. It can find racism in anything, even if it has to read your mind to do it. Critical race theory is a uniquely American invention. Brewed up at Harvard Law School in the 70s, now part of the academic and media mainstream, it is also uniquely un-American because it rejects the core tenets of the American classically liberal Judeo-Christian value system.
All right, so there's a few problems with this, and I'm gonna stop and start through this. First of all, sometimes the classically liberal traditions clash with the Judeo-Christian values, and sometimes Jewish traditions clash with Christians' traditions. America does not have a singular set of values because it is constantly changing, and it has a multitude of cultures just along sectional and regional lines. So that's one thing that I really don't like. Anytime they talk about, oh, this is American and anti-American, there is no singular American value here. But again, when we talk about a theory or it being mainstream, you require some degree of evidence. So if I wanted to look at how much critical race theory is prevalent among right-wingers or how much I want to see it in college, I'd like to take like maybe a collection of studies in specific departments. How much critical race theory is applied in X profession? How much is it applied in A's discipline? How often is it applied to sociology? And here's the other thing: it's not like this form, it being in the mainstream means it is the mainly accepted theory. That's the other thing. There are multiple theories for examining how prejudice or abuse or racial discrimination occur. There's questions over how general oppression occurs. Colonialism and imperialism are economic in some cases that don't necessarily always fit within the critical race theories, though it depends on how someone uses it. Again, like, it's not a monolithic thing. There's liberal feminists who might not like the way in which critical race theory is used to take away from questions of gender and things like that and focus on race. And those people will likely still be left of center because they're liberals. You might have socialist feminists who are upset about the way in which critical race theory overemphasizes. Thanks for the follow, David GL. Really appreciate that. You might have socialist feminists who don't agree. I'm not trying to make any point about feminism one way or the other. I'm just trying to point out how feminism is an example of a diverse set of thought. So I'm not taking a point. You have a really stupid PragerU video. I'll be happy to talk about that in a moment. Yes, you can just send it in chat, and I'll save it and I'll look at that in a moment. But what I want to look at right now is just talking about how it's important to look at theories as a diverse set of things, that critical race theory is not the singular theory. My point is that there are different ways in which sociology and the humanities look at these things that does not fit a one-size-fits-all. Application matters. If you want to take a look at like how critical race theory might be applied outside of sociology, I'll give you an example. In history, if someone wanted to apply a critical race theory perspective on something, like, say, the way in which we teach history surrounding enslaved people, they might look at, say, the way in which resources or certain sources are used. So some have argued that when we overemphasize documents, we can sometimes undermine how we talk about people who were illiterate, who had their own interests, and we may overemphasize wealthy, powerful people who were literate. So if you wanted to talk about an enslaved people and their history, you might want to look at oral history if you wanted to apply a critical race perspective, because a lot of enslaved people were not permitted to read or write or things like that. So that would be an example of critical race theory making a genuine historical critique and focusing on the role of power in a specific time period as it relates to race, which would not happen if we were to, say, ban it. And David, I don't know, I'll check that link out, but I don't want to just pull something up on here if I'm not sure what it is.
It turns the bedrock American idea upside down. Here it is in the words of Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanczyk, two leading proponents. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order. including equality theory,
I will.
legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. It does this because critical race theory proponents assume racism is present everywhere and always, and they look for it critically until they find it. And they always find it. It has to be there because that's how the imperial European powers and then America set things up. Here, as in all dangerous academic theories, there is a kernel of truth. Human beings were not preoccupied with race until the 16th century, when Europeans began to explore and then colonize other parts of the world. Drawing distinctions between the races reached its peak in the 19th century with the widespread use of slave labor in North and South America. No one denies this. But since then, the Western world, and most especially America, has spent a lot of time, money, and blood breaking free of its racist past. It's been a rocky road for sure, but great progress has been made.
So here's a few things, the way they present this. For one, yes, there's a good way to look at the way race was in fact a social construct. So I'm actually glad that PragerU has been willing to talk about this. But the issue, David, I already saw your meme, and I know what you're just trying to do. You're just trying to troll the chat, so I'm not clicking any more links that you sent. In terms of the way in which social constructs were created, yes, race as an idea was created for the purpose of maintaining racist hierarchical systems that controlled society overall. But when he talks about it as though there was an increase and an improvement, what measure is he using? He doesn't explicitly say here. Because if we look at what happened to the civil rights movement, and I'm sure they'll bring it up as if critical race theory rejects the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, a lot of it was destroyed by red baiting and the very sort of commentary that we're seeing right here. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee constantly had to deal with accusations that they were Marxists, anti-American, and the very same rhetoric that we're seeing here about these ideas in academia, indoctrinating people. We see it here as well. So it's a little weird that it says that progress has been made, but then engages in the same sort of rhetoric that we just don't need. Really quick. There we go. So yeah, that's another thing that's a problem. So that is gonna be an issue. But yeah, the framing's a bit messed up here.
Critical race theory says all this progress is a mirage. Racism never died, never even faded a little bit. It just hid itself better. Critical race theory, therefore, is not a continuation of the civil rights movement. It is
I've always heard this argument that like liberals or leftists tend to view critical race theory as an extension of the civil rights movement. But the thing is, there is no extension of the civil rights movement. Each movement has its own unique thing. There is no 100% perfect system to fully analyze where the civil rights movement begins and ends. And even then, there's some historians who argue that we shouldn't look at it as the civil rights movement because it wasn't a singular movement. It was a collective movement. You had the Council on Racial Equality, CORE. You had this Southern Christian Leadership Conference under Dr. Martin Luther King. You had the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under Ella Baker and Bob Moses. So all of these organizations had their own goals, and they differed fiercely. And some of them were socialists, some of them were liberals, some of them were black nationalists. So this idea, you're not going to get a continuation of the civil rights movement because it's never intended to be a singular movement. It was a brutal, decades-long fight that in some cases succeeded, but in other cases failed. I mean, the rise of the Reagan Democrats and eventually the Republicans with them was based in part as a reaction to this to push back on things like that. So,
in fact, a repudiation of it. To critical race theorists, Martin Luther King was both wrong and naive. White Americans can never judge blacks by the content of their character. They can only judge them, always unfavorably, consciously or unconsciously, by the color of their skin.
See, I just want to point out a bit of a rhetorical trick that they'd used in this. They used this in the way they just kind of quote like two critical race theorists, and then from there they just juxtapose their own interpretation of it as that is the position of the theory itself. And whether or not you agree with critical race theory, this is a bit of a deceptive way of looking at it. Like, if you wanted to talk about intersectionality, they probably are going to talk about the exact same thing in the exact same way, even though in some capacity, intersectionality sometimes could be considered more lenient in terms of how it views the dynamics between race. But anyway, there's just some trickery here. But I will say, why is it that every time conservatives talk about Martin Luther King, they only point out the content of the character quote? Because if you read his letter from a Birmingham jail, he's pretty clear that he does not like white moderates who don't do enough. One of the main points he makes is that he was disappointed with the white moderate who was more concerned about peace. I'm from America, but I'm not going to give out my full location. I live in the United States. But why do you need to know my state? Okay. Yeah. You can check my Twitter and you'll know. I'll get to that in a moment. But like when you got Martin Luther King being addressed as just saying, I believe that every person can be judged solely by the content of their character and not race. That's the ideal he was setting up. But there were other things he brought up too. He was talking about the role of economics as it related to race. That would later kind of be part of one of the reasons that intersectionality started talking about those kinds of things, and critical race theorists would talk about this as well, that economics and race is still a major part of an analysis on this. So it's kind of weird that they talk about Martin Luther King, but they ignore all the other aspects of his discourse. Additionally, I think it's a bit frustrating and frankly dishonest, and I've written about this before, that Martin Luther King is just seen as this guy who said stop playing the race card. Because if you look at like the March on Washington, the March on Washington wasn't just named the March on Washington. It wasn't just about ballot boxes and votes. All of those things were very, very important, but it was also about economics, because the March on Washington was also known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That was another thing that comes up. There was an economic consideration here that came to be a really huge part of his critique of American society, and this whole attitude that it's just don't play the race card, that's what MLK would have wanted, is just false. He talked about race quite a bit because that was kind of the problem at his time. If you can't talk about race when we're talking about racial oppression, then you're not going to be able to deal with oppression itself. That's a massive problem.
Ironically, not since the Aryan obsession in Germany in the 1930s and 1940s, or South African apartheid in the second half of the 20th century, has a social movement been so obsessed with race. Critical race theory is then, in a very real sense, a counter-American revolution. But that's a positive, not a negative to those who subscribe to the theory. The American experiment was given a 400-year tryout, and it doesn't work. So let's scrap it. That's what they believe. Is that what you believe? I'm going to guess.
I get why a lot of people, including people I know personally and respect, view the long history of the United States in a singular continuum, that it's just America's big experiment. But the truth is, America was constantly changing in ways that sometimes the people didn't always control. There's no one singular path to what constitutes America. America as an idea is a mesh of cultures, of belief systems, of sometimes contradictory. No, I'm not a groyper. Contradictory things along those lines, of identity, of regional problems, and all those kinds of things. And yet, it's not that. A lot of times people like this talk about America as this idea of this singular great experience. Okay, I know who I'm removing from the chat. Governist. There will be no groypers in my chat. I'm not having any groypers today. Thank you for the follow, but I am not having you in the chat doing this kind of thing. There will be none of that. Look, I don't normally, I don't ban critics. The groypers have some really messed up views, and I don't want to be associated with them in terms of what they might do to my channel. I just started. I don't need that right now. But what was I saying? Yeah, so America was never this singular path to glory. It was a constantly changing thing. It was a constantly developing thing. And it was always about how society grew much because the people needed it to, not because there was just some city on a hill that everybody likes to think of it as. America does not follow any one singular path. And I'll get to another video too because there's other stuff here
that most of you don't. So how do we stop critical race theory before it infects the brains of too many decent Americans, especially young people, and turns us into something we have never been and shouldn't ever want to be? The answer is simple. Refuse to accept it. Don't be intimidated by the heads I win, tails you lose logic of this self-destructive, America-hating, anti-reality idea. Don't be bullied into thinking that you're racist when you know you're not, or that you're a victim when you know you're not.
Why is it that every time somebody wants to talk about how power plays into society and how that can sometimes hurt people, some people seem to believe that you're just trying to be a victim? Recognizing that somebody is trying to harm you or there are societal structures that are destructive to your interest, to you being free as a person, is a way in which you can learn to fight against it. There was a reason you had things like Highlander School in the civil rights movement. There was a reason we had these discussions that civil rights activists had to learn and be trained to fight against political systems in the South and in the North. Recognizing the way power affects things is a part of self-determination. It's part of how we grow. Now, I'm not saying critical race theory is the only method to do it. Some of the ways in which critical race theory tends to promote... Why was I timed out? Did I accidentally time you out? I think I may have tried timing out Gubbinist because I thought he was... They were trying to... spread groyper stuff. So if I accidentally timed you out, David, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do that. If you're just sending memes, it's fine. It's just a joke at that point. I don't really care. So apologies for that. Hello, Socialist Wonk. Thank you for the follow. I appreciate it. But, hello, how you doing? So one of the things that I think we really need to remember here is that critical race theory in academia, at least in its sociological and history and things like that, is not related to just a singular theory. It is one of many different theories and discussions. It is part of academia, but it is not the only theory that people use to examine racism in the United States. Yeah, it's just I don't want my content getting flooded before I've even begun, is all I'm saying. I'm perfectly willing to have people in chat who disagree with me. I just don't want groypers in here, mostly because when there's one, there tends to be 15 after that. Oh, there it is. He's a groyper too. David, look, he's not just a liberty activist. The man literally hates Jews, and I will not tolerate that at all. No, Fuentes is a groyper. Fuentes is a groyper. Look, I'm gonna just focus on this right now, so...
Defend yourself while you still can.
Right.
I'm James Lindsay, founder of New Discourses for PragerU University. Thank you for watching.
So that is their little spiel, and I think it's a bit of a misrepresentation of what was going on with critical race theory. But he actually did an interview...
Therefore is...
And they did an interview involving the PragerU did another video. They did an interview over this, but what I wanted to talk about is why this is such a frustrating thing. Because it's one thing for them to make a video that gets millions of views, millions of clicks and whatnot, but how that affects people's policies and how that makes... Okay, I think I'm getting raided or something, but that's okay. In terms of like how that causes people to react, it affects policy. So on the local level, we had some interesting things by, I'm just going to pull up the thing, the issues with Tennessee. So if you go to the Tennessean, so earlier this month, Tennessee actually decided they were going to ban critical race theory from their public schools. Hopefully they don't make me get behind a paywall for this. Okay, cool. So the General Assembly for the state of Tennessee has banned the teaching of critical race theory, and it was passed at the end of the legislative session, which means that they were specifically looking at how it was being taught to talk about race, but they did this at the end of the session in order to avoid debate, which, frankly, that usually is how it goes when you ban an academic theory from being taught in public schools. Now, personally, I don't really know. I'm not sure if anyone cares about this much. I think it's kind of important to talk about why this matters, because this doesn't exist in a vacuum. PragerU's decision to go and like engage in this kind of rhetoric plays a role in what this stuff happens and like how this grows, how it builds. So we will get to the PragerU video, but my point is that it's not just this one state. There were other states that did this too. So that's my main point. I'm not going to go through the entire article because Lord knows that's going to be a problem. But yeah.
Author and founder of New Discourses, James Lindsay. James's new PragerU video is titled, "What is Critical Race Theory?" where he breaks down the controversial theory that is dominating educational institutions across the United States. While many people proclaim that critical race theory is the continuation of the civil rights movement, James explains why it is actually fundamentally opposed to the great civil rights movement of the 1960s. Let's jump right in. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I'm actually a huge fan. I read your book, Cynical Theories. I watch a ton of your interviews, so I'm really pumped to have you here.
Oh, that's exciting to hear.
I watch a ton
Thanks.
of your interviews, yeah, so I'm really pumped to have you here. Something you brought up in the video is that critical race theory is explicitly anti-American. I want to play a quick clip, and then I have a question for you.
Here it is in the words of Richard Delgado and Gene Stefanczyk, two leading proponents. Critical race theory questions the very foundations of the liberal order, including equality theory, legal reasoning, Enlightenment rationalism, and the neutral principles of constitutional law. Legal reasoning. Critical race theory, therefore, is not a continuation of the civil rights movement. It is, in fact, a repudiation of it. To critical race theorists, Martin Luther King was both wrong and naive. White Americans can never judge blacks by the content of their character. They can only judge them, always unfavorably, consciously or unconsciously, by the color of their skin.
The premise of critical race theory is totally antithetical to what Martin Luther King stood for in terms of judging people by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. And yet, so many people, millions of people, have been hoodwinked into believing that this is the continuation of the civil rights movement. How did that happen?
They've done a really good job of branding themselves as the unique pathway to anti-racism. They've also...
So, again, I said this before, critical race theory is looking at the role... Yeah, no, it's not worse than segregation. I'm sorry, but the segregation quite literally was enforced at the barrel of a gun, at the edge, with guns, knives, and all sorts of violence. And I'm not going to get into particulars because I do not want to get banned by Twitch. So, no, critical race theory is not equivalent to segregation or any sort of thing like that. Now, I would say critical race theory, yeah, this is how we're doing this. I'm not going to be answering chat right now. Chat seems to be on its own. Critical race theory as an idea is, again, one theory that examines the role of power. It does not necessarily presume that every single person who is white is racist. They're making a point about societal structures influencing the way in which we think about race and the way it upholds abuse and things like that. So that's the main way that it looks like this. I have a bad feeling that I'm getting rated.
Also branded themselves as the inheritors of the civil rights movement, and the people who were seeing how the civil rights movement wasn't able to accomplish everything in a fundamentally racist society. So they needed to propose a new way to take it, as they say, beyond traditional approaches to civil rights into a new way that then kind of throws the whole thing out and comes at it from exactly the opposite premise. It's not well known, but it's a very famous thing that back in the 1960s they would march in the civil rights movement with placards that read, "I am a man," not "I'm a black man." They weren't proclaiming their identity first. But if you actually read the critical race theory literature, you find them saying things like, there's a fundamental difference between a statement like "I am black" and "I am a person who happens to be black."
Okay, so this seems to be that same sort of discussion that says, like, if you talk about race, you're inherently being racist and things like that. Well, I want him to be banned because he was calling for the hanging of CNN people. No, I think you guys need to distinguish between violence. If you cannot distinguish between the role of free speech and violent speech, then you're not going to do all that well in terms of how you analyze these kinds of things. So yeah, I support Nick Fuentes being banned. Glad to see that whoever decided to raid my chat today is looking at my articles. I hope they read it every day because that really helps me out. So thank you for reading my work, everybody. Yep, I am getting raided. It really is funny because I don't really mind this stuff.
Because the second of those, "I am a person who happens to be black," puts humanity first and identity second, whereas "I am black" puts identity front and center and allows it to be useful for a very different kind of identity politics that rejects what the civil rights movement was all about in the first place.
Well, yeah, I think of that iconic sign. I think that was maybe 1968. It was the Memphis garbage workers protest. And the entire idea of that sign was to emphasize the common humanity.
It's also worth noting that the reason that there has been a shift in the way in which black activists talk about these kinds of things is that the activists of the day were looking at race neutrality as the bare minimum, because they couldn't simply say, yeah, we have a black heritage and we're not ashamed of that. They had to start with the basic thing of don't hang us, don't kick us out of the schools. It's not like these things were completely like separate from that conversation. Intentionality matters here. It wasn't just some moralistic thing. It was a pragmatic thing. So it's a really disconcerting that there are so many people who treat it like, oh, they just wanted to talk about being treated like a man and now everybody doesn't care. They just think white people are racist. That's not what's happening here. 1 sec. I'll just play this real quick.
Of those garbage workers with all the other men or humans in society. So it's amazing, actually, how completely opposite this new approach is. Critical race theory has been really successful because it exploits our Achilles heel as a liberal society. It really speaks to the things that we're concerned about here, like justice and fairness, and it really hacks into human psychology in a really genius way. And once you start to understand how it works, you start to see why people have really latched onto it. Does critical race theory have any weaknesses?
Yeah, it has actually a number of weaknesses that are pretty easy to exploit. Number one is that the depth of their analysis isn't very deep at all. So it's actually, if you spend just a little bit of time with it, it starts to become easy to see through it. It becomes very easy to see that it's a manipulation. It doesn't have, again, very much depth at all. So for example, once people realize that they say things that critical race theory is a movement designed to reject the fundamental tenets of the liberal order, all of a sudden the spell that, oh, this is the liberal side of things falls away. When they say that we reject equality theory, this is straight out of one of their books, then people will say, wait a minute, but I thought equality was the point. when they say things like that they reject Enlightenment rationalism, legal reasoning, rule of law, and neutral.
Well, wait a minute. The original quote wasn't that they reject it, they question it and how it's applied. Like, if somebody claims to be rational and objective in all things that they do, and again, I'm not a critical race theorist. My frame of mind is I don't think there's any singular theory that is effective 100%. It really depends on a case-by-case basis. If, like I mentioned earlier, if you wanted to examine the role of memory and history and how that plays into how we view the past and racism of the past, the questions over which documents you use in understanding history and how you represent a group of people, that would be a good point to say, yeah, maybe we should look at the role of race and power, or the way in which we examine these things. That would be a good point. But just looking at critical race theory and simply saying, oh, this is just them rejecting all these things, that's not what they're saying. They're saying you're questioning how it's applied. And even in James Lindsay's own original video, he explicitly said that they were questioning it, not rejecting it. Because questioning something is not the same thing as saying, oh, it's nonsense, or it doesn't matter, or it's useless. It just means that you're trying to examine its application, how it works, whether or not it's effective. That's it. Also, it's a standpoint theory, so yeah, it's going to have some flaws. Standpoint theories are not perfect. They're useful to an extent, but they're not the end-all be-all of discourse.
Principle of constitutional law, people get upset, a little uncomfortable with this. So this opens a door for people to say, wait a minute, this isn't what you're selling me, right? You're selling me a nice picture on the outside of the box, but what's inside is garbage. And then it's already to the point where the majority of people who aren't caught in its sway no longer, if somebody says you're a racist, you're upholding white supremacy, they don't go along with it anymore. So it's already to that point where people are realizing that it's a manipulation or even an extortion that's being pulled on them from false premises. So its weaknesses in its shallowness and in fact its cruelty and its willingness to be racist. You know, one of the biggest cracks in the armor has come up just recently this year, where there's rampant anti-Asian American racism being perpetrated and then defended from within critical race theory by saying that what needs to happen is that the Asians need to recognize that what's really happening to them is white supremacy, and that they have to then, you know, interrogate.
So there's two ways to approach this. On the one hand, yeah, there is certain ways in which some people talk about Asian Americans that sometimes is incredibly demeaning. It's incredibly disrespectful. But I don't think that's unique to critical race theory. I think a lot of times when we talk about racism and prejudice, we tend to see a look at just purely on black and white people, and sometimes Latino people are brought into the equation. But a lot of times Asian Americans and their experiences and how they have developed and how they came into positions in society and how their experiences are unique in and of themselves and valid, tend not to get discussed. So I don't think it's quite like how James Lindsay is discussing it, because he's going to make it sound like, oh, they're just part of white supremacy, they just want to reject it all, and they don't want to listen to Asian Americans. Most of the time what they're actually talking about is how some people get sold myths about themselves to distract from the way in which they're already being mistreated. And I think most Asian Americans are not only very aware of the way in which they're being mistreated, but also the way in which other people are being mistreated as well. So I really would be cautious of this idea that Asian Americans are not aware of the way in which white supremacy affects them and others differently. Because that's the other thing. When you examine power, not every critical race theorist is going to come to the same conclusion, because they might be examining different things.
Their own anti-blackness instead of the clear things that are actually happening to them right in front of their own eyes. And Asians, by the way, Asian Americans, especially immigrants from countries like China and Vietnam, are not really likely to fall for this. They're not going to have it.
Oh, wait, explain that again. So this is their...
I'm not trying to speak for other Asian American or minority groups. What I'm just trying to say is I'm questioning the way in which he's portraying how these things are used. Also, if you just come in like to say like, oh, yeah, this is gonna be a thing. I'm not. Look, if you want me to talk about the model minority myth, I'm happy to do that in another stream. but we're not just gonna have like a bunch of people just jump in here and start stuff, okay? Like, I'm perfectly willing to talk about that. A lot of the ways in which the model minority myth plays a role in white supremacy is very complicated, and the historiography on that is still developing. But yeah, well, thank you, Jim R Gaming, for at least letting me like stop with that. Like, cause other people came into this chat and they just kept pounding me with things and didn't let me get on to the next subject. So I appreciate you at least asking the question and then letting me continue. So props to you for being good on that.
Own internalized anti-blackness that is manifesting as anti-Asian discrimination?
Critical race theory holds that every race that isn't black and every political position that isn't critical race theory is inherently anti-blackness. That's one of its very simplistic assumptions. Everything that's not it is anti-black. That's what they position. And so you end up with people like Kanye West, who happens to be black, putting on a MAGA hat and saying, I think for myself, and Ta-Nehisi Coates writing, a day later, you're not black anymore. You have Joe Biden standing up and saying, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. This kind of thing.
I really doubt Joe Biden actually cares about critical race theory in any way. Critical race theory is much more like an academic thing. It is not looking at whether or not like politicians are not really paying attention to this thing. So that's another thing. I really think that whenever someone talks about an academic theory, they need to stop pretending like a lot of these politicians care about it, actually. Most of them don't. Most of the politicians will appeal to certain rhetoric, terms, and things like that. If you were at Jim R Gaming, when I started this stream, the point is when you examine the role of race, you're not necessarily trying to use that as the entirety of the discourse. You're trying to examine the way in which power plays a role in harming people because of race. You're not trying to simply say, oh, all white people are terrible, or all X group is entirely anti-black. What it's trying to do is examine the way in which race plays a role because you're trying to prevent it from doing harm. That's the main goal. Now, I am not a critical race theorist, by the way. I said that earlier in the stream. I just don't appreciate it whenever some of these people like come in and talk about these kinds of things and they misrepresent what other people say. We'll have to disagree with that, Jim R Gaming. I'm more interested right now in looking at how he's representing the theory. If I want to talk about that later, we can just talk about that at another stream. But right now, I'm much more concerned about the way in which conservatives are basically just using this as a boogeyman without actually examining a lot of it. His video that I previously went over before you joined, he changed the quote a little bit. Yeah, but MLK didn't just say like you judging people by the content of their character. That was the ideal, but he also examined economic institutions and the way in which certain groups of people also didn't care when they could just be comfortable. If you read his letter from a Birmingham jail, he talks about how the white moderates were specifically unwilling to come to the aid of black activists because they thought they were causing trouble. So yes, I hold MLK in high regard, but it's not like some of his ideas didn't come into consideration when critical race theorists came a decade later. What do you mean? You mean Democrats? Also, I'm not going to be answering everything in chat all that much anymore because I got to get this video is still quite long. It's 16 minutes and we are 40 minutes in.
That they've got this whole idea that everything that's not their ideology equals anti-blackness. So now you have Asian Americans getting beat up in the street. They're hiding the fact that many of these crimes, not all, but most are being perpetrated by black individuals. And then they're telling the Asian community that you have to, if you call for police, that's you being anti-black. If you call these people out, that's you being anti-black. Then they try to leverage this idea that Asian Americans must have anti-blackness as well, and that they uphold white supremacy. And it's just ludicrously cartoonish at this point for people to have to deny the evidence of their eyes and what's actually happening to them. Meanwhile, they're getting discriminated against in schools, and that's being justified also on exactly the same premises. And they're supposed to just ignore this and pretend that it's not a thing. And it doesn't work at a certain point. The shallowness is revealed.
What is this right now? Hold on. Yeah, not deal with that guy. Yeah, I that was just a hodgepodge of things. It wasn't really attacking any aspect of the theory. It was just a gish gallop at that point.
So you sound pretty optimistic that you think there is a shift in our consciousness about what's going on. I mean, I do a lot of coverage of some of the stuff going on in K through 12 schools, and I still see a lot of parents are afraid to speak up at these school board meetings, mostly because they'll be called racist no matter what they're opposing. Pornography in schools most recently. Would you say that you think the majority of people are starting?
He doesn't exactly say exactly what theory are you defending CRT. I'm not defending CRT necessarily. I'm more talking about how they're misrepresenting a belief. Like, you don't have to, let me put it this way. Do you have to agree with an ideology to find it frustrating when somebody misrepresents it? In my opinion, no. You don't have to agree with every aspect of the theory for some person to misrepresent it. So, like, if I say I prefer intersectionality as a theory and I believe it has more explanatory power than, say, critical race theory, I think he's misrepresenting it because earlier in the video, he said, in the previous video, Jim, we had a lot discussed earlier. So you've missed quite a bit. So I'm sorry about that, but you've missed a bit. So I'm not going to respond to chat all that much right now because I want to get through this. I keep stopping.
Starting to see this, or like, do you think we have a lot of silent people? What do you think is going on?
For me, more people are aware of it than I thought would be by this point. As a matter of fact, nobody was supposed to be aware of what was going on. Everybody's supposed to be way behind and not even clear on what's going on at this point in the progression. If you think of how they've used this to try to move through society, and lots of people are still silent, but people are also starting to speak up. And we're starting to see people realize, I have to say something now. It's not going to burn out. It's not going to go away on its own. And that courage begets more courage. And I've been seeing this kind of snowball of courage begin to roll. Now, the institutions are very heavily captured and they're way behind. They're going to lag behind all of the stuff that's happening on the ground. But there's a lot of energy right now.
Can I just say, like, it's kind of interesting whenever somebody, and it doesn't matter if it's conservative, liberal, socialist, or whatever, says that, like, academia is all in this singular position. And this isn't a critique of his position on critical race theory right now. This is just me talking about the rhetoric he's employing here. Firstly, in terms of, like, the history departments, I was a political science and history major. I recently graduated. Historians actually vary widely on what they accept as good theory. Like, there's certain consensus. There's a certain consensus surrounding primary sources and things like that, and the importance of historiography and peer review. All of those things are well and good. But in terms of, like, whether or not we can examine things objectively, there are still some historians who might not want to say, no, we can't objectively look at history. Or they might even reject critical race theory as an effective method to examining the past, because in some cases you can use it in such a way that it can become anachronistic to the way in which you're looking at a certain event. Putting today's racial connotations on the past can sometimes be damaging to our understanding of said past. So it's not like the overall academia is just ignoring the way in which things happen or trying to set a singular thing. There is a lot of disagreement on, not only online, but in academia, in public history, in academic history, in pop history. There is so much disagreement on this stuff that the entire field of historiography and the things that are involved quite literally are centered around argument. So it's not, this whole anti-intelligentsia thing is just nonsense.
Now, I keep hearing from political candidates that are telling me in different races how much energy there is when they bring up the idea that they're going to challenge critical race theory and take critical race theory out of our schools, out of our workplaces, out of our federal apparatuses, out of the military, like Tom Cotton is attempting to do. So there's a ton of popular energy behind that. And if politics actually does follow culture, then the culture is already shifting very rapidly.
So you made an interesting comment about, you said that no one was supposed to be aware of it by now in its progression. Is there a sort of plan that you've uncovered, or where are you getting that from?
Well, I mean, Yes, then it's not really uncovered. They
Yeah.
say it all the time.
Right.
It's in basically everything they write that they have this kind of intention to come in and infiltrate the institutions. It's sometimes labeled as the long march through the institutions, in the words of Rudy Deutschke. And the idea has been for a while to mainstream this stuff and to push this stuff. You know, we're seeing these new revelations about CNN and how they're implicated in some of this. And the idea with the long march to the institutions is that this goes back 100 years to Antonio Gramsci. I don't mean to get heavily philosophical with you, but the idea was to get inside of the institutions and create a counter hegemony, a counterculture within the institutions, and then have it all burst out at once. And that depends on the people not knowing what's happening to them. That depends on using words in incorrect ways or novel ways, so they don't realize what's happening. And something obscure like critical race theory, this is very academic theory that uses very thick academic jargon and published in academic literature that nobody reads. It wasn't supposed to have a public groundswell against it, according to the people who wanted to.
Wait, if nobody reads it, then how is it really affecting the overall, like, system? Because if nobody's reading it, it's not really indoctrinating people now, is it? Like, now he's contradicting himself. He's just saying nobody reads it to denigrate it because he wants his audience to just be like, oh, yeah. Nobody reads it. Who cares? It's just some intellectual jargon or whatever. But if it's as, like, abstract or as alone as he likes to think it is, then why fearmonger about it? If it's just in these isolated academic communities, they're not really doing much with it now, are they?
Infiltrate the institutions and install it at the level of policy before people would be able to push back against it.
It felt like critical race theory really kind of went mainstream around the early 2010s. I was actually working in education at that time, and I got a little preview of it working in schools, but it felt like it really burst into the mainstream, like on university campuses and in the news around maybe 2012. Do you have any theories about why we were so vulnerable to it at that moment in time?
Want to help your community but not sure how? The answer lies in finding.
I hate ads.
I mean, a lot of things were happening then. One, of course, is the quick rise of internet platforms like blogging platforms and social media that allowed for very different capacities for communication, I guess. And so there's those kind of structural issues. There's also the fact that it was able to be mainstreamed on the back of the reaction. There was a racist reaction that arose when Barack Obama was elected president in 2008. And that was very easily spun into a narrative that says, look how secretly racist American society really has been. They can't.
The thing was that okay, first of all, it wasn't that they were secretly racist. There were racist rallies among the Tea Party about this. The previous president of the United States quite literally gave this idea that the first black president in our entire history was not born in the United States, and he was born in Kenya, and that he, the president of the time, had to submit his records to some failed businessman. Like, that was the arrogance behind it. So it's not like this was this nonsensical thing that just came out of left field when Obama was president. It came as a result of all this discussion. And even then, it wasn't necessarily a critical race theory perspective. Most people were just sick of people saying horrible things about the first black president.
Handle the first black president. And that narrative, though, that America is secretly racist, is the heartbeat of critical race theory. So it was able to kind of start mainstreaming there. Also, we had come to a point where the march into the educational institutions had largely borne fruit. They had gained most of the administrative and institutional positions of power in our education system and our teaching colleges.
Again, critical race theorists are not the only ones. Okay, what about the Baltimore riots? Like, what about that? Okay, yeah, there are a lot of contrarians today. So yeah, there are plenty of problems with what happened over Obama. But look, I'm not going to go into everything that went wrong. I'm pointing out that there was some serious racist crap that happened to him.
And in universities
But what I'm trying to say here is, for the most part, what he's trying to make it appear is that there is this idea that there's this march into academia just to control everything, and it's the singular group of academics who do not care. And that's just not true. anytime that, say, a critical race theorist might come forward and says that race and power is the centerpiece of understanding our state of our country, a postmodernist will come along and say there is no objective truth. There are Marxists who say no, it is not the relationship between race that matters. It is the idea of class and class conflict. All of those things are contradictory. A lot of times the people tend to try and mesh all these things together, but in reality, they're in conflict with one another. And many times they're fighting. Now, some intersectional people will argue that yes, some of these things are actually interconnected, like race and class can play a major role in how people are beat down all the time. But those aren't always the same things. People very strongly disagree on this.
The early 2010s. Furthermore, the theory had kind of matured. It was kind of, when it first came out, people would have to say, well, according to critical race theory, or in critical race theory, they'd have to, remark upon the idea that they're using a theoretical lens. About 2010 or so in the literature, you see that kind of stop, and they just say the things that critical race theory says as though they're just true. And so there is a maturity of the theory all kind of coming to a head at that point as well.
Something I heard you say in a past interview is that critical race theory is like a vat of strong acid, and it kind of dissolves anything you put in it. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea of a critical theory in general, is that it's supposed to find and tear at the alleged contradictions in everything. So it's supposed to pull up moral contradictions. We're supposed to be a country that lives up to all men are created equal. Well, look how unequal things are. Look how inequitable outcomes are. So anything it attaches to, it kind of eats away at it morally. It also eats away at it claims that it's looking into the underlying assumptions and tries to eat away at those things. It tries to take founding principles and kind of pervert them to say that.
Pointing out that like a historical figure had cognitive dissonance when it came to their self-proclaimed principles is not in and of itself like malicious. It's just not. When you point out that there's a contradiction in Jefferson writing all men are created equal and then him owning slaves and fathering children with one of those enslaved people, it is entirely reasonable to point out that, hey, these figures did good things, but they contributed immensely to abuses that today we would see as completely unacceptable, and in some cases in their time, others did too. So that's not an acid tearing away at the foundation of the United States. It's examining the way in which figures of the past made horrible choices that contradicted what they said. If you want to look at, for all the talk of you got to examine history, the good and the bad, this idea that critical race theorists are just coming along and just looking at these figures to just denounce them seems to me like an attempt to say you cannot talk about the bad things, otherwise you're just being a critical race theorist contrarian or whatever.
That those values either are never meant to be lived up to, or that in fact they hide or mask white supremacy. So it slowly eats away at anything. That's the point of a critical theory, is to dissolve the fundamental, like at the level of understanding the thing itself, like understanding who you are as an individual, understanding who you are as a company or an institution.
Also, I kind of think he's mixing up deconstruction of postmodernism and postmodern history with critical race theory. I mean, there is some deconstruction involved in critical race theory, looking at power dynamics and all that, but postmodernism will also kind of deconstruct a concept in its part and try to rebuild it and try to see what it means. So I think he's making a bit of a mistake there, or he's just mixing up his language.
It's like dissolving those fundamental values at the very basic level, so that you don't really have that principled position where you can stand in yourself and feel confident in yourself and say, no, this really, we were on the right track. They try to get into that and to dissolve everything by this tool of problematizing, saying, here's where it falls short. Here's where it's not perfect. Here's where it causes harm. Here's where, one thing after another, revealing the so-called contradictions within everything.
So you sound a little bit optimistic, which I like.
I just have to say, as like an interviewer, and I've just started doing interviews now, if someone were to say pointing out contradictions in logic is a problem, I would push back on them and say, why is that a problem? Because the our country as it stands right now, while it owes a lot to our predecessors in the founding fathers and Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, Washington, and all these guys, it also owes a lot to other generations too. A very good example of this was in How Democracies Die. It was a really good book by two political scientists, and they examined how a lot of the political culture that allowed us to maintain civil discourse today actually came from the generation after the founders. That's their argument. So to some extent, the idea that examining and looking at the contradictions of the founders' behavior is not destructive to America. It can actually help us understand why the next generation acted the way they did, because they knew what it was like to live with these kinds of people. I mean, we could take a look at how Hamilton expressed this idea of virtue and civic virtue, but in terms of what he was doing behind closed doors, he was cheating on his wife. Those kinds of things are worthy of historical consideration.
Hopeful are you in terms of our ability to withstand this ideology here in the U.S.?
We are at an inflection point, actually. If you would have asked me 2 months ago, I would have been much more pessimistic. Like I said, this groundswell, people realizing that they can have courage, that they can speak up, and some of them will be removed from their positions or lose their jobs or be subjected to trials. But in the end, that if each person who stands up, it creates a possibility to push back against this. You see the person in Allison Collins and the San Francisco School Board, for example, there's something is moving there. It was not an easy fight, but she's being stripped of her power and may end up recalled. So we're starting to see the ability to push back wake up. So I am a little bit more optimistic than I was, but I think we're at a crucial inflection point where we have to start to remember what our values are. We have to remember who we are. We have to remember what we stand for as a country, and that we stand best united, genuine unity, not what we're trying to have sold to us, And so I don't know, but I still stand by the claim that if we keep allowing critical theory to be mainstream and dominant, if we keep giving into its manipulations and tolerating its manipulations, then eventually it will dissolve the sinews of our society. And
this is where I kind of, and this is not the historical perspective or anything like that, this is where I have an ideological problem with him, or perhaps a political problem with him. As I pointed out earlier in the stream, and others may have missed this, the way he talks about American society as if it has a clear set idea of itself, rather than an intersecting and contradictory and sometimes changing way of identifying itself, seems to suggest that the only way that a society can exist is that if it remains stagnant. And that's not true. We've never been a stagnant society. We've always been changing. We've always been in conflict with ourselves to some extent. We've always had shifts, whether they are sectional, racial, economic, religious. There are numerous ways in which we as a society shift and change over time.
American civilization, it can happen here, will fall apart. Western civilization will fall apart.
Oh, there's the Western civilization crap.
Thank you so much, James. Where can people find you online?
They can find me personally on most social media outlets.
Nope, I am not letting him. So I am not going to be his promotion boy right now. So, yeah, that was their theory. That was their discussions. But I wanted to bring up, since other people were upset with me for bringing this up, and I'm going to do it anyway because it's my channel. But I wanted to talk about why this matters, because it's one thing if you've got people like James Lindsay coming along and just running his mouth about what critical race theory is and only quoting two actual critical race theorists. And even then, I believe one of those was actually only partially interested in the theory and not in its entirety. But this is why it matters, because the GOP, just earlier this month, have actually attempted to sign a bill to prohibit critical race theory in the military. Now, I don't think, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're actively teaching critical race theory in the military. I don't think there's any statute or military code that requires that. I tried finding some, but I don't think I was not successful. So But they wanted to say this, and they wanted to go after this. So, quote, the first bill is a companion to legislation introduced by Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas that aims to prohibit teaching, quote, anti-American and racist theories, unquote, such as critical race theory at any academic institution related to the U.S. Armed Forces. The Stop CRT Act works to codify former President Donald Trump's executive order banning diversity and racial equity training for federal employees, an order President Joe Biden reversed in January. So, for those of you who are familiar with Senator Cotton, you will know that Senator Cotton is the same man who wanted to take funding away from any school that used the 1619 Project in any capacity. And I don't know if any of the people who came into the chat today actually went into my articles on that, but the 1619 Project is a flawed piece of history. I will not deny that. But it was an attempt to re-examine an reviewed perspective in our history. It did not. A lot of the ways in which we talk about history do not examine some of the ways oppression took place, and a lot of the historiography, as I brought up earlier, did not do enough to look at how Black people themselves have advocated for their own. Very few people know who Ella Baker is. Very few people know who Fannie Hamer is, despite many of them being very, very strongly involved in just the civil rights movement before Dr. King was even involved. So there's clearly a need to re-examine the way in which we look at race, because a lot of people don't care about these kinds of things, or they don't know. Now, the 1619 Project has a couple of flaws. For one, Nicole Hannah-Jones' essay that kind of asserts that America is founded on racism implies intentionality without a lot of primary source evidence. But her overall point about how American society is very centered around racism is strong, I think. So there were some schools. So I think Cotton, he has a history of this kind of thing. He doesn't like when the Orthodox school of history gets critiqued. Who just followed? Scrublord. Oh, thank you, Scrublord 1963. Very nice. Let's just continue. Kids kick ass. Okay. He said that the initial bill, quote, stands for the idea that CRT does not belong in our armed forces. The Stop CRT Act will be the most comprehensive legislation to restrict the spread of CRT. The bills are the latest in a string of proposed legislation targeting diversity and anti-racism teaching, which is being characterized as critical race theory. Not all forms of anti-racist activism are CRT. So, yeah. And then it started after the September 2020 memo that Trump gave out. They've been doing. This is tied specifically to Trump and their way of examining this. But yeah, like these guys are. Thankfully, the Democrats aren't going to allow this to happen. And as much as I have my problems with Democratic members of Congress and the Senate and the House, I am not too concerned that this is going to get anywhere. But my point is that it won't get anywhere on the federal level, but it does on the state level because Tennessee was able to do it. The thing for me... There we go. So, the point of this is, if they're willing to actively pursue this policy as it relates to just this particular theory, then they're probably willing to examine things. They're probably willing to restrict other theories as well. They might not want to look at intersectionality. They might not want to re-examine the ways in which previous forms of history, such as the Lost Cause, were used in a racist way. All of those things can be seriously harmful to academic discussions, discourse, and things like that. And if you have a problem with these theories or anything like that, you are free to critique them. I have no problem with people critiquing any of these theories. You are free to do so at any given time. That's part of the process. But when you actively encourage the state to interfere with academia to prevent them from being able to discuss these things at all. You prevent them from being able to either examine them empirically or examine them just as a matter of trying to understand their undercurrent beliefs. And that is not going to help anybody out. So, yeah, I think if this continues, we're going to have a major problem with academia overall, and it's not going to get better, and we're going to see a very, very different view of what it means to study in the United States along sectional lines, because it's not just Tennessee that did this. Iowa has also attempted to do this as well. So if any of you... No, I'm not coming from a government interventionist point of view. I'm explicitly saying that the government should get involved. Yeah, I am against the government getting involved in academia because in the past, during the 1960s, and they were very, very much willing to engage in red betting. During the McCarthy era, they were willing to do the same. It's not a good idea. That would be Jim. That would be one of my main issues here. I think my issue is that they're actively like using this theory that not all lefties agree with. The thing about the implementation of CRT is it's not taught as just the whole truth. It's not going to be like this main big thing. Forced implementation. What do you mean by forced implementation? Because if you're just having somebody talk about the theory as a concept, then it's not necessarily a problem. Because if they talk about it as an academic approach and its weaknesses, as was taught at my college and others around here, depends. Like, again, if you have to like say CRT is the best approach to understanding racism in the United States or in the world to get a good grade, then that's perhaps not. Then that's not going to be a good thing. But if you're talking about like a sociology professor explaining the distinctions between the different perspectives on oppression or how some sociological theories examine these things or how it relates to other disciplines, then that's not forcing them to agree with the theory. They're just trying to teach them what it means. And in that case, I have no problem with them teaching it. Like you can talk about how you can talk about feminism and things. And if you're not, remember, you should support force. I think we're talking past each other at this point, Jim. But yeah, this is going to be all for tonight because I have to go. I think we're talking about. I'm ending this stream in a few minutes, Jim. If in another stream, maybe I'll dedicate it and talk to you about this more. But right now, I just think right now we should not have the government intervening in all of this, especially when the Republicans seem to not fully understand its implications in relationship to other theories. Yes, I do have a job. Several actually lined up. So, thank you. If you guys would like to talk to me, well, right now I just got out of 9 job interviews, so I'm not going to divulge like personal information. I've already just said where I'm from, and I've not given the exact location. And I've already been brigaded by people who like literally sent me death threats a couple weeks ago. So I would not on here, but like I had my email blow up, and I really don't want to do that. So I'm not going to put like my exact job out there. If that's okay with you, Jim, I would rather not. No, I know you're not trying to be rude or anything, Jim. You're not trying, despite our disagreements on this, I don't think you're trying to cause a problem for me. But I think part of the issue, my neighbors just went through the backyard. I almost had a moment. The thing for me is whether or not you intend to do harm to me, other people can take this, and I appreciate that. Initially, I was concerned that someone else was coming in there. Oh, you're libertarian. Okay, so I kind of feel, I get where you're coming from now. But no, what I was trying to say is, like, if somebody, like, takes a clip and finds what I do, where I work, and causes problems for me, it's not going to be safe for me. So that's going to be all for the stream today. Thank you all for coming in. I understand that some people had some very fierce disagreement with me. Some of them good faith, like Jim, and others not so much. But I appreciate you all coming on. Thank you so much. And I look forward to talking to you in the future. Good night.